Welcome back to Hope Show on the Road. Woo! So today I have with me Momi, it's clinical psychologist, Craig, a mental health counselor, Camille, a behavior analyst, and Breanna, a speech pathologist. So we have been tasked to talk about social communication, and I know with our previous discussion on joint attention, it lent itself to naturally, because these things happen, naturally occur together. So, you know, when I talk about joint attention, social communication, social cognition are kind of that trifecta that happens naturally. We just try to separate them in therapy so that we can have a better idea objectively what are we looking at, and to help us make clinical decisions on some of the things that we're actually going to be talking about with this panel. So the first thing I just want to start off by talking about, we had Jenga as our activity, I guess. But what I watched them try to do is try to not have social communication. So Craig's going to tell us a little bit about kind of what they saw and just some of those implications.
Yeah, so one of the things that was really interesting was that everybody, we're going to stop, using prosody and using all this communication, and every so often you get like, ooh, or a... And so they really couldn't turn off the prosody. It was just a natural flowing thing that we kind of all do when we're in a group setting. One of the other interesting observations I saw was that one of our team members just kind of went while someone was trying to reach out to a piece, and immediately their hand shot back because of that social communication that, like, hey, that's not a safe piece to pull.
Yeah. So thinking about that, the contingent action, when we think about co-regulation and our adjustment, so we are adjusting to that person, whether it's like, ooh, not that one, when we really mean, like, don't take it because it's probably a good one. And we're communicating that, and there's kind of this banter happening, but it's also with the people who, one, can't help to express it, but the other person who's going and trying to take a piece can't help but to respond to it. And so as we think about that and trying to turn it off, and I saw, unrelated, but cornhole, whoever's team that was, Danielle's team, was supposed to not, were you guys like no prosody, nothing?
Well, they can talk, but no prosody, no facial expression, no gesture.
And whoever walked by, Gabby, you walked by and you're like, are you guys not having fun? Because it looked like you guys are having a terrible time. So very, very hard to do. So one of the things that thinking about, to me, this is a big one, for collaboration. And we think about collaboration, with speech. But when we're looking at a clinical eye to this, there's a lot of co-occurring language disorders that comes with autism very commonly. And Breanna can go through a little bit of those. But when we think about those things, we have to better understand, what those underlying, language things, challenges might be, as we're kind of expecting, one of our clients or even someone we're communicating out in the world, not necessarily a client, not understanding that there might be other things going on. So you want to kind of talk about some of those that
Absolutely.
commonly.
So something that's really important is to consider those co-occurring language and speech impairments. Having a speech impairment may prevent our clients from being confident in a social situation or in a planned engagement. A lot of times, the language deficits that we see in our kids in particular are social language deficits. They may not be able to look at a facial expression and tell you how a person's feeling. They may not know that a smile means I'm happy and a frown means I'm sad. So those are things that are really important for us to consider when we are planning engagements and when we are putting our students in social situations where they have to use those skills that they may not have yet. It's really important for us to collaborate with other disciplines because in speech we see, we specifically look for those social communication, nonverbal skills using prosody, using gestures, using facial expressions. And it's important for us to communicate with the rest of the team working with our students what our students are capable of doing, because we don't want for OT or PT or the guides to ask something of our students that they don't have the skills for. So it's important for us to be able to let everybody know what skills they do have and how to help our students communicate in a way that's effective to them and not in a way that's effective for us. So being able to let our students use nonverbal communication or use gesturing, that is one of my favorite things about the Hope Source, is that we don't require verbal communication. If that's not effective for our students, we find another method for them to use.
Thinking about that and thinking about those, I go back to one of my first experiences before I started the Hope Source, having, being trained in DTT and having to do man programming and things like that. This little girl who kind of changed my life was she had a very severe apraxia, but the program was a 3 to 5 second program, and I knew that she was diagnosed with it, but we weren't collaborating with a speech pathologist, say what are the implications of this, because it was such a delay. It was like 1 minute and 15 seconds, and not understanding that she couldn't get the words out on here, and we were making her, and thinking about those. I mean, that's a very, very serious ethical thing, but understanding, okay, what does this mean? What does apraxia mean? How does articulation, other, speech delays have on mental health, the effect on, all of that? We need to kind of just go deeper sometimes, and I think that's where we need to do better at saying, okay, especially if I'm doing language programs, especially if I'm doing things like that, because we don't really know. I even think about muscle. I know you guys do a lot of, work in speech with, if I physically don't know, I think I'm smiling, okay? I think I am, but physically I cannot do it. Then what are the implications behaviorally? It's just so important that we don't do enough of that, especially when it comes to social communication with the outward expression. We do a really good job here with all of the nonverbal, but making sure. I just think about all the kids in those programs where they're having to man and things, and are we looking at those types? So I think of that just the ethical implication of that. So with that, the tag teaming off the expression, the team kind of was talking about the role of the therapist and the guide and their expressions. So I don't know, Camille, do you want to kind of talk about training? I coined a term, this is no offense, I coined it and maybe one day I'll be a millionaire. It's called millennial blank face. Okay, and it is a thing I started seeing about 6 years ago in interviews, and I don't know if it's just millennials, I'm just saying that, okay, but, because I'm technically a millennial, so, understanding the, not realizing they're not emoting. So I'll be in an interview and I cannot read the person because they're not emoting. And it was becoming more and more almost like, 1 in 3 interviews were like that. And I had never seen that before. I think that has to do with social media and us having, my theory is, when we talk about cell phones, but thinking as we're reading and we had to read something and maybe laugh out loud, and we actually don't laugh out loud because we're in public, so we've learned to not emote as we're reading, as we're looking at things, and not realizing that over time that's actually causing us to not emote to other people. So thinking about that and thinking about the implications of looking at yourself as a clinician, as a guide, as a therapist, what that is. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of the goals that we do focus on here, we are teaching our clients to perform these super, super dynamic skills like responding or engaging in using nonverbals. So there might be a therapist who is brand new to ABA, who has no idea how to even use nonverbal or facial expression themselves. So a lot of times it's our duty, well, my duty as a BCBA, to really train them to basically think outside the box. So, this thing may feel silly to you. You might be embarrassed, but we have to really exaggerate when we're teaching, because you have to think the client has no idea. So when we're thinking behavior analytically, you might hear like airless teaching. So this is brand new. So when we're first teaching it, we have to go all out. And then the goal is that as the client gets more comfortable with us, as you get more comfortable with stepping out of your comfort zone, the better they are going to respond to those things. So that's constantly something I've observed, especially with people new to the field. A lot of like younger, new therapists who, like you said, kind of have that resting face that I've had to train to be like, hey, we have to really teach this, so kind of let loose and do.
Yeah, I think it's just that self-awareness, and we we're always supposed to be checking ourselves and asking ourselves, like with our clients, we're asking them to do very, very hard things. If we're not going to kind of improve areas and take feedback on, and I might not even realize I'm doing that. The flip side is exaggerated, but also knowing when exaggerated is too much. For some client, they could be misinterpreting a big exaggeration also. And so it's kind of finding that balance, and that's what I love about, kind of this process is it's just, individualized to the child, but also just constantly moving back and forth and meeting them where they are. In that regard. So thinking about meeting them where they are, we were talking about the cultural implications too. So when we think about ethics and social communication is kind of a big one when we think about when we're making clinical decisions and cultural humility, cultural competence, things like that. So what are the kind of the bigger things with social communication that impacts?
Well, there are so many.
Yeah, go closer.
There are so many things, and like I often talk about orientation, in orientation, that you cannot cover all the different cultural differences, but you need to be aware about what could be different from your beliefs or your common sense. So the example we talked about was eye contact, and I may get uncomfortable if you are not looking at me, and I may interpret that you are not listening to me. But some cultures, that's disrespect. So being stared at is not good. Or you can do with peers, but you cannot stare in eyes with the adult population that you gotta respect, and that's disrespectful. So there are many different meanings or hand gestures. Probably you know some of the things cannot be done here, but can be done in the other countries. So those are the things that you gotta think a little bit that teaching is good. You gotta think about the clients, where they come from, what kind of families they're going back. And you don't wanna do harm by teaching something that to culturally matching with where they come from.
Great. Any other, you guys have questions for us or thoughts? Lee?
Don't take this as a funny question, like it's a legit serious question. How is the millennial blank face different from RBF, like resting?
Well, if you're resting face, which I have, so yes, but you hear me talking all the time. But if you're emotive when you're speaking, so your resting is you're resting. But if you're speaking and, eyebrows don't move. If you actually just like watch like TikTok, you'll start to see it if you haven't seen it before. People aren't moving their faces. It's very, very interesting. It's actually a lot. So it's just not realizing that even you can see it like in their eyes a little bit, but it's not squinting. Like when you're smiling, your eyes aren't even smiling. I don't know if that's Botox, but I guess that could be. But that's the difference, is that when I'm in my resting state, I'm not doing anything or not talking. But once I am talking or talking to someone, I'm super expressive, and you can tell what I mean and what I'm saying based on that. So, yeah.
There have been situations where I'll have given feedback to someone or like a guide, and then I'll see them the next day and be like, "Are we good?" Because I'm the kind of person who wants to make sure we're good. So I guess I see some of that, but it's just interesting.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about this in the last activity and in our group, but how do you judge where a client starts off? Like when they are first joining the host course, how do you gauge what level of social communication is going to be like active in their treatment plan?
Yeah, so when a client first comes to us and we're doing that assessment to determine where they are, the first thing we look at is co-regulation. If co-regulation isn't there, then it's kind of like that's our starting point. And usually the easiest thing for that one, because using takes a lot of, you have to, collaborate to understand why they may not be using the expression. But then you're looking at joint attention. Are they shifting? Because generally, if you're not shifting, it's the likelihood that you can't read. Because that's the only reason we shift or for joint attention is to read the nonverbal, to read the verbal, check the verbal, that kind of thing. So usually we just kind of go with what is the easiest and the foundation when they don't have those. But our focus is first on that feedback system, on co-regulation and joint attention, knowing that again, there's a lot of cusps happening because those things in typical development are happening all simultaneously. And so with us, if you're starting to co-regulate and you're starting to shift, that all starts to kind of domino developmentally. So that's kind of why we put it in there, knowing that as long as they don't have other barriers. So
They didn't have other barriers, like they had co-regulation, joint attention, and we were opening it up to have some social communication. Practice. I know we have like levels.
Yeah.
But like, how would you judge?
We test. So for us to determine if they can read, we'll give very, very simple. We kind of play this like hot and cold game. Is one of the things that we do. So if you can, it's kind of like hide and seek, but we lead you there, and we are doing that with prosody, with facial expression, and gesture. Gesture is the easiest one. If they can, a lot of times are not able to follow the point to where it's going, so they just start wandering around the room looking for it, and it's like, oh, I'm telling you, but this isn't meaningful. That's usually the easiest in terms of that kind of the hierarchy of it. And so if they can't do that, and then we'll retest in other ways, and then it's like, okay, that's where we have to start, because the other prosody and facial expression are much harder than gesture. Or if they can't use gesture to show us where to find it, they're always like, it's over there, and they're like staring at it, and they like run and get it for you, kind of thing. So it's just kind of breaking it down as far as we can to make sure that they're successful. But if it's in the treatment plan, then we're not seeing it. So, or we didn't see it in that, and then we may see it out on the floor as we start to see co-regulation and things like that, because of that cusp dominoing. So, yeah. Any other questions? Belle?
So earlier you mentioned that you had that little girl client and they just didn't take into consideration of her other diagnosis. So her treatment appeared to be not successful. So as a therapist or a clinician, how do you advocate?
That's why I quit. Oh, no, I didn't quit her. I quit DTT. It was, I did advocate, and that's when I started noticing that if I just waited, and unfortunately that consultant at the time, was fortunately they were open to it. Unfortunately, it was kind of been 3 years. And all of the goals were like failure to progress, and it was just a praxia and a delay. And so I basically just said, I'm not doing this anymore. And the family was on board, and I just showed them when I waited that she had all of her programs mastered. She just couldn't say it. Then there was nothing that the consultant could say to that. It was he saw it for himself in front of his eyes, and was on board with it. So I just advocated we're just gonna wait, or just get a new therapist. I don't know.
I have a question.
Yes.
So I know that a lot of the population we work with is attracted to content like TV shows and movies where people have exaggerated facial expressions, like Thomas the Train or anime.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it'd be possible to use the content, look at the content they're interested in to see where they are in their social communication?
I know that there are places, I'm trying to think of what that place is called, that are using kind of, I don't know if it's a part of video modeling, but there is some research on, and that's a little different, but a lot of research on video modeling. And so I'm sure that we can. Yeah. And the goal is also, to get that from the other person so you can learn a lot of things. But yeah. I think teaching those, but some of them aren't really super realistic, but Thomas is pretty good. So, any other thoughts or questions? Jason?
I know one of the things we were talking about was how deficits in your social communication can kind of be a barrier to getting a really effective spotlight, like whether that spotlight is truly getting through to that client at that time. It's just something to talk about that a little bit.
So in terms of the guides having difficulty,
It can go
both
like
ways.
you're saying, like, if I'm giving you a thumbs up for what you did, but that thumbs up doesn't really mean anything, that's not going to be an effective spotlight. It's not going to reinforce their behavior.
Right.
In the future.
Right. And I think that's a excellent point. Why are we doing that if they don't know what this means? I mean, we can, pair the meaning, over time and make this mean that. It won't generalize too great if we kind of train it that way. But yeah, I think being kind of, cognizant as a clinician, being cognizant of the way that we're attempting to reinforce, we need to be thinking about if we're like, woo, or yay, or something like that, there is a lot of prosody. And if I can't hear that, then, and I'm wondering why it's not effective, that the starting place would be looking at where they are, where they are in that goal, collaborating with speech, things like that, to be able to identify that. And then maybe we can shift, so how do we pull that down? Or where are they at in reading those types of things? Or do we just need to be very, very clear? And the words need to matter, not the tone, not the, and those are what's awesome about the clinical decisions and how much we have to actually think about.
Can I add something to that from
Sure.
a speech perspective?
Yeah.
So we work in speech a lot on the nonverbal communication, on the facial expressions and the gestures, and even the prosody too. I mean, obviously we work on verbal skills, but we are addressing those nonverbal skills, hopefully to help in a therapy setting so that they do know what a thumbs up means, and they do know what, when your voice raises at the end, that you're asking a question, or that when you're louder, that means you are either excited or you're angry, and they have to look at your face to determine, are they mad or are they excited? So those are things that we work on in speech therapy to hopefully make that a little bit easier for not only the guides, but also for the students.
And that's what I love about the other disciplines. So while we have, in ABA, and we have the RBTs working on goals and providing all these opportunities over and over and over in kind of natural settings where OT, speech, mental health are really like, zooming in on it in a very, very specific way, and to really help us. So they meet their goals faster because of what we're doing, and vice versa. So that's why it's just really, really, really so critical.
Well,
You were going to say something?
Yeah, so I think all the profession, what we have in common is like a good assessment with families too. They are source of good information. So we ask them and what kind of language or what kind of signs they show excitement and good or bad, stuff like that. So those are really needed. I mean, we don't need to solve everything.
Yeah.
Parents often have answers for that.
Yes.
What do you feel when, like, cultural expectations and quality of life in your eyes kind of coincide, and you're like, and the parents are like, oh, that's cultural, like that's a cultural norm, that's fine with us, and then you're like, I don't know if that helps their life though. You know, like what do you do in that situation? Is that
Mhm.
just, I mean, respecting the family, obviously, number one, but still trying to push them to grow, like, is it just stagnant at that point?
I mean, that's a very great question. That, what do we do when the cultural norm for that family is different one than our expectations or our culture, and we're seeing our client maybe fail because we are respecting the family's cultural norm, but we're seeing that as like a roadblock in our everyday setting. I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah.
That's a tough question.
I know,
That's
a
tough.
lot to talk about, and I kind of want to have like a black and white answers to this, but we don't. And I think it's a more of a discussion. We kind of check ourselves about our values and beliefs about how certain things to be done, and then also you kind of learn about their families' backgrounds and learn that. And do you negotiate and trying to figure out what's the best? Also, you need to think about the future of the family or child too. If they are here for, I don't know, 5 years, and then they may find themselves in their own cultural places out of countries, then you need to really think about what's the life gonna be like. And we don't wanna do harm by teaching something that's not useful. But again, you gotta think about, are we the right people to do that too? If it's really against your beliefs and values, then you may not be the right person to treat the kids too.
Great question. All right. Thank you all. Good job, guys.